You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 14th of May, 2025 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, broadcasting live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Chris Chermak. Coming up on today's program.
I will be ordering the cessation of sanctions against Syria in order to give them a chance at greatness.
Donald Trump meets with Syria's interim president al-Sharaa after ending U.S. sanctions on the country. We'll have the latest from Saudi Arabia. After that, to Emmanuel Macron's big 3-hour French television appearance. We'll visit Estonia's largest military exercises of the year, and we'll hear about the life of Uruguay's late president.
Mujica was still popular when he left office after 5 years. Uruguayan presidents are limited to a single term at a time.
And finally, we'll turn to the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, their annual summit right here in London with Monocle's own Tom Webb. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Chris Chermak. U.S. President Trump's trip to the Middle East has taken some surprising turns this week and has now included a meeting with Syria's interim president, Ahmed al-Sharaa, marking the first time that a U.S. president has met a Syrian leader in a quarter century and coming after the U.S. unilaterally lifted sanctions on Syria's government. Trump has also called for the Islamist group HTS to be removed from a terror watch list. The question now is whether the European Union and United Nations might follow suit on some or all of these measures. Well, joining me now from the UAE is Nada AlTaher, senior foreign reporter at The National. Nada, what can you tell us, first of all, about this meeting with al-Sharaa? It has just taken place in the last hour or so.
The meeting was quite important and even historic, even by Sharaa's own words. The lifting of sanctions, they were surprising and not surprising in a way, because Sharaa himself had been lobbying fervently with Saudi Arabia being his first foreign destination, calling the UAE and meeting the Qatari leaders when he first assumed leadership of Syria. And the news itself of the lifting of sanctions is quite important and significant for Syria, both practically and on a diplomatic level, because the news itself was celebrated in Syria with fireworks and cheers, and the country might finally be able to focus on rebuilding and development. And Trump's meeting with Sharaa himself is also a sign that the U.S. has formally recognized his legitimacy as a leader on the global stage. We also know that President Erdogan was there virtually, but it shows that Erdogan could have Donald Trump's ear when it comes to Syria. And Erdogan and Turkey, of course, has a vested interest in Syria's stability with the return and the return of millions of Syrian refugees who have taken Turkey as their home. President Trump urged al-Sharaa to help to prevent the resurgency of ISIS and to take control of camps such as Al-Hol, where security is run by Kurdish SDF members, and the Kurdish SDF was, of course, supported by the U.S. So now that the U.S. and Syrian governments are potentially cooperating on ending the resurgency of ISIS, it does put into question the role of the Kurds in Syria. There are lots of questions, but definitely the overall impression of this meeting is positive for so many of those involved and the stakeholders in the Middle East.
Nada, to go into a little more detail about the lifting of sanctions in this meeting and what might have taken place, sort of what the U.S. will have gotten in return. You mentioned some of the security angles there. There is also a sort of transactional angle to this, is there not? Sort of concessions on oil and minerals, even this promise of a Trump Tower in Damascus. Is there a kind of understanding, do you think, in the region, Syria and in the region, that this is how you deal with Donald Trump?
I think it's quite clear how you deal with Donald Trump, and I think it's becoming clearer the second time around of him as president, that world leaders are learning, and for the Gulf and for the region, they're very good at it. We've seen this in the meeting with King Abdullah in the White House, which went really well after a disastrous one by President Zelensky. We saw the difference there. The preparations for Trump's visit are also in a way that Donald Trump enjoys, with a formality and a celebration of his, the significance of him as a president arriving to the region. So it's all going quite well, I would say, for the region and for Donald Trump in a way that suits him and is to his liking. And I think, yes, there is an understanding on how you deal with Donald Trump. And there is a way also to explain in a way that works for him things that the different states and the U.S. diverge on without upsetting him to a degree that he would resort to extreme measures. And I think all of this was seen very, very well at the U.S. GCC summit, with all the Gulf states mentioning Gaza and Palestine and their support for a Palestinian independent state, while Donald Trump was on the table. They're not speaking in vacuum. They're speaking directly to him. And it's quite clear that this is an issue that the U.S. and the Gulf diverge on. But I think everyone's focusing on the glass half full and the issues that they do agree on in order to resolve issues that they do not agree on.
Well, then, speaking of that glass half full, when it does come to Syria, and you mentioned this GCC summit meeting as well, you also touched on Turkey, but I'm curious more broadly as well how the region is going to react to this move to lift sanctions on Syria. Syria is, of course, complicated for the region. A lot of players, including Turkey, Israel, Iran, are sort of involved. Will this be welcomed, this move to allow Syria to develop and really go at its own pace?
Syria has been welcomed by the region already. We have seen Ahmed al-Sharaa being celebrated and welcomed in different trips and meetings and calls. So that is not something that is a problem for the region, not at all. And we have seen exchanges of thanks being made from and towards, Saudi Arabia and Erdogan and al-Sharaa, between all of them. I think it's in everyone's interest that Syria becomes stable, and with the weakening of Iran's proxies in Syria and in Lebanon, and now the U.S. recognition of the legitimacy of al-Sharaa and the sanctions removal, all of this allows Syria and al-Sharaa to show the gains of his own victory, both in Syria to his people and to the world. Why the world should trust him to lead Syria, given his past, obviously. So I think it's all in everybody's interest. Now, when it comes to issues, Israel is still an issue, in Syria, with its territorial expansion and airstrikes that have been unrelenting. And we know that during Donald Trump's visit to the region, he did not include Israel. And U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth also canceled his trip to Israel. So it's quite interesting to see the kind of warming of U.S. Gulf regional ties that are seeming to sideline, if not, temporarily, Israel, which is a thorn in Syria's side and, frankly, is a security issue for the region.
Just quickly, before we let you go, Trump will be in the UAE from tomorrow as well. Can we expect the same sort of appearances, celebration of him there that we saw in Saudi Arabia? How is the UAE's welcoming of him going to differ?
The UAE and the Saudi Arabians and the Gulf in general have similar protocols when it comes to trips and visits like this. The difference will be that in Saudi Arabia, there was a Gulf U.S. summit. And so everybody was, taking turns in speaking and explaining what their foreign policies are, making statements and taking positions. And with the UAE, it might be a little bit more closed doors, but we do expect some statements coming out from Qatar and the UAE following these different meetings, and if not, immediate reflections on what those meetings that are being had would have said behind closed doors, then definitely in the long term, we're going to see the rewards of these trips being reaped.
Nada AlTaher, senior foreign reporter at The National in the UAE. Thank you very much for joining us. And now here's Monocle's Anita Riota with today's other news headlines.
Thanks, Chris. At least 60 people have been killed, including 22 children, in a series of Israeli airstrikes in Gaza. This, according to local hospitals. The Israeli army said it conducted a precise strike on an underground Hamas command center beneath the European hospital in Al-Fakhari. The deaths come as UN Chief Tom Fletcher warned action was needed to prevent genocide. Antalya is hosting the NATO foreign ministers' informal meeting, bringing together top diplomats from all 32 member states. It will feature NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte and U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, among other high-level officials. Burberry has warned it could cut around 1,700 jobs, which would represent about 18% of its global workforce. This would come in an effort to turn around the business and reduce costs. The company disclosed the plan as part of a push to generate an additional £60 million of savings by 2027. Former coach and Jimmy Choo chief executive Joshua Schulman was also recruited last July to help revive Burberry's fortunes. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Anita. French President Emmanuel Macron's decision to dissolve Parliament last year will long be remembered as one of those own goals in politics that sapped Macron of his influence in domestic French policy. The president has since mostly focused on his role as a statesman, a foreign policy chief, but yesterday he did seek to return to the domestic political fold, if you will, with a 3-hour unique television interview that included promises for reforms, or referendums on major reforms rather, before his term as president is up in 2027. Well, here to tell us more is Simon Bouvier, Monocle's Paris bureau chief. Simon, tell us first of all about this format. The spectacle of this television interview was pretty unique.
Bonjour, Chris. Yes, it was negotiated between the Élysée and TF1, the French broadcaster, and essentially it featured TF1 journalist Gilles Boulot as the moderator, and he had a succession of kind of co-hosts who had different kind of specializations. One was a journalist, one was at an ultra-liberal think tank, one was even a fitness influencer, each of them asking different questions of the president. And so this was billed ahead of his appearance as a kind of 2-hour opportunity for the president to reinsert himself into the domestic policy discussions, since, as you noted, he had been largely focused on international affairs in recent months.
And when it came to that format, it was not an easy one for Macron. Personally, I remember the days when Tony Blair, after the Iraq War, sort of threw himself in front of audiences in the UK to try and explain himself. This sort of harkened back to that, didn't it? Macron trying to explain himself to an audience and interviewers who were pretty skeptical of pretty much everything he's done.
Absolutely. And I think that I don't know if he was expecting it, but certainly he is quite skilled at this exercise. And he kind of mounted spirited defenses for all of his different policies, so much so that the original scheduled time for this show was 2 hours, and it ended up lasting 3. So, he has a reputation for going long, but, he ended up defending his record on everything from physical education to nationalizations to, even social questions. There's a big debate currently because of law being examined on potentially legalizing assisted suicide, for example, which has been very controversial. So he really took a stand on all of these things.
He took a stand on a lot of these, but also there's this question of referendums, isn't there? In part because Macron himself admitted that he's kind of powerless to do a lot of the things he wants. What do we expect from this referendum side? Will a lot of this actually come before the French public?
I mean, it's very interesting, right, Chris, because we're in a moment where French politics, which are traditionally characterized by a very strong president who has a legislative body at his beck and call, who can essentially implement the agenda that he was elected for without any trouble, in a state of unprecedented division and disarray. And people are getting a bit fed up with what they see as essentially governance at a standstill. And so both on the side of opposition parties who want votes and change on a number of their pet issues, and on the side of both the president and the prime minister, this referendum has been brought up as a potential way out or avenue to make tough decisions with an extra dose of democratic legitimacy in this divided system. But I think it's a bit of a red herring because, for instance, one suggestion was to organize a referendum on whether to move the retirement age back to 62, the way that it was before President Macron's signature and controversial retirement reform. But it's the details that matter, right? It's how you finance this retirement system that is the key to all of this. A lot of these complex issues can't just be decided by a yes-no question.
And just very quickly, Simon, beyond the domestic stuff, there were also foreign policy angles to this. He promised sanctions for Russia if there are no ceasefire talks, but also maybe touch on quickly this nuclear umbrella chat. Will it be expanded beyond France, but possibly at a cost?
Yeah, I mean, I think the president has been an advocate for more what he calls strategic autonomy, what Chancellor Merz has called independence, straight up from the United States. And for Macron, one of the principal vehicles for that he's been talking about more recently is to put the French nuclear umbrella at more ready disposal of his European allies. There was always this doctrine that, the vital interests of France and the vital interests of its European allies are one and the same. This phrase, vital interests, is what determines whether the president is willing to essentially use nuclear weapons or not. So there has always been this idea that if the vital interests of allies in Europe were to be threatened, France might put its nuclear weapon at their disposal. But here there's questions of, okay, so do we start deploying to replace the reluctant American nuclear umbrella, French warplanes that are equipped with these weapons in allied countries like Germany? He's a strong advocate for it. It would expand France's influence. So let's see if it happens.
Simon Bouvier, Monocle's Paris Bureau Chief, thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. This is The Briefing. I'm Chris Chermak. Estonia has always been one of those countries pretty worried that if Russia were to consider expanding its military conquest beyond Ukraine, the Baltic nation would be high on the list. Which is why Estonia's military is currently in the middle of its largest set of training exercises of the year, with help from other Baltic nations as well as the UK, France and Canada. And joining us from those exercises, known as Hedgehog 25, is Petri Burtsov, Monocle's Helsinki correspondent. Petri, you're right there in the thick of things. What's been happening around you today?
Hey, Chris, or tere päivas, as they say in Estonia. So exactly as you described it, we've been in the middle of it all. We've been this morning with some French troops. We were actually hiding inside a hangar because it's, it's not a show they put on for us. It's an actual war simulation. So we were hiding from drones. Then after that, we spent time with some UK troops actually in the trenches, and we've just basically left the British now, and we are by the side of the road driving towards Tallinn. So we've been in the south of Estonia monitoring this exercise, very close to, just minutes away from the Russian border in the south of Estonia.
And Petri, the way you sound, frankly, it's quite fun. I'm sure it's exhilarating to be part of something like this, but obviously there's an incredibly serious element to it. What does it feel like to be doing this just, as you said, not far from the Russian border?
Well, that's the thing, Chris. I mean, to an outside observer, as such as me as a journalist, it just looks like a fun war game that they're playing. Nobody's actually going to get hurt. I mean, they are firing live rounds, but it's all safe and all that. But I really get a strong sense that when talking to soldiers, especially the Estonian ones or the other Baltic nations, that things could get real. We are so close to the Russian border, and there's a lot of talk about, if there ever was war between NATO and Russia, then Estonia would really be in the front lines of it all, having a sizable Russian-speaking minority here. So, I mean, it is. I think it has taken on a different sense of urgency, an exercise like this. It's more than just about sort of NATO members, always the allies practice together. They need to learn how to fight together. As it's an alliance that has actually never fought a war together. So there's a lot of issues that they need to practice. But there's just this sense that somehow now this is more real. I mean, people are joking around, but they're also a bit more serious than you would expect them to be.
And when it comes to those realities, Petri, I understand these exercises are in part about kind of tailoring a NATO response to what Estonia needs. What does that mean in practice?
In practice, it means that the wartime scenario that they're simulating and practicing here is sending reinforcements. So as you know, NATO has this forward presence in the Baltic countries. We're talking about a couple of thousand troops. So obviously that's not going to be enough to defend against hundreds of thousands of soldiers potentially attacking the country. So it's about sending reinforcements and how fast those reinforcements from other allied countries can arrive into Estonia and how soon they can be battle ready. I mean, the Brits that we spent time with, the battalion, they basically deployed from the UK. I believe it was from Scotland. They deployed in 48 hours. So they got the alarm, and in 48 hours later, they're battle ready in the trenches in Estonia. So that's what they're practicing, and that's really crucial for the defense of Estonia and the Baltics.
And to flip the question finally, Petri, is NATO learning something from Estonia as part of these exercises as well, because of the fact that Estonia is on the front line?
Definitely from Estonia, not only from Estonia, there's actually a lot of Ukrainians here as well. So drones have never been as an integral part of an exercise that they are today. And actually the troops that we've been meeting, they said that they've learned a lot about drone warfare, how to spot the drones, how to hide from them. And that is something they've learned from the Ukrainians, from the Estonians. They've learned also Estonia has many companies working on drone defense and missiles, anti-drone missiles. So they've learned a lot about that as well. And then I think it's mostly, it's a mental thing that you're so close to the Russian border and you go into this mode that, hey, look, they know that the Russians see what they're doing, and there's all kinds of spying and sort of hybrid operations going on. So I think it's also this sort of a feeling that you get when it's very different being here as opposed to practicing somewhere in France or UK or Germany.
Petri Burtsov, Monocle's Helsinki correspondent. We'll let you get back to avoiding those live fire drills in Estonia. Thanks for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Uruguayan president and leftist icon Pepe Mujica has died at the age of 89. A former guerrilla leader, Mujica is credited with turning Uruguay into a progressive and stable bastion in Latin America. Here's Andrew Muller with his story.
I'm wondering, how do you feel about the fact that you are being described so much lately as the world's poorest president?
No, pobres son los que me describen.
It is common for politicians to project themselves as modest, frugal, humble creatures, righteously unentranced by the trappings of power or temptations of corruption. It is less common for them to live this ideal quite as rigorously as Uruguay's 40th president did. Even as he served as head of state and commander-in-chief from 2010 to 2015, José Mujica, usually known as Pepe, lived in a tumble-down farmhouse with no running water, his security detail outnumbered by chickens, a three-legged dog in the yard. He gave almost all of his salary to charity. On arriving in his country's highest office, aged 74, he declared his net worth at $1,800, the approximate value of his baby blue 1987 Volkswagen Beetle, in which he drove himself to work. For one reason and another, Mujica had gone much of his youth and middle age with little in the way of material possessions. He saw little reason to begin acquiring them in his dotage. José Alberto Mujica Cordano was born on May 20th, 1935 in Montevideo. His father, a farmer, died young and broke. The Uruguay in which Mujica grew up was not as grimly repressive as it, along with much of Latin America, would become, but it was undergoing an amount of turbulence, as global conditions reduced it somewhat from its envied early 20th century status as the so-called Switzerland of the Americas. There is nothing quite like a middle-class miffed at a mild reduction in their prosperity for fomenting revolt. On hand to channel this anguish was lawyer and agitator Raul Sendic, who formed a Marxist guerrilla organization called the National Liberation Movement, better known as the Tupamaros. Mujica joined in the early 1960s. The Tupamaros undertook a trajectory congruent with that of broadly contemporary and similarly inclined malcontents in Europe, the Baader-Meinhof Group in Germany, the Red Brigades in Italy. Which is to say that the Tupamaros positioned themselves initially as a somewhat better-armed analogue of Robin Hood and his merry men, robbing banks only in order to feed the poor and clothe the destitute and so forth, before graduating to bombings, kidnappings, murders and other actions which aroused suspicions that melodramatic violence had rather become the ends, not the means. Even though his comrades endowed him with the cuddly nom de guerre Florero, the florist, Mujica was very much an active participant in the Tupamaros' rolling insurrection. When the Tupamaros attempted to conquer the entire town of Pando in October 1969, Mujica led the squad which seized the telephone exchange. In 1970, he was shot 6 times by police while attempting to evade arrest, the beginning of more than a decade in prison, interrupted by a couple of escapes, one when he and his comrades inside tunneled out, one when his comrades outside tunneled in. In 1985, Mujica was among those released under an amnesty which accompanied Uruguay's return to constitutional democracy. His prospects were unpromising, an unemployed 50-year-old revolutionary bearing the considerable physical and psychological scars of solitary confinement and torture. He had spent some of his imprisonment held at the bottom of a well, his meals lowered in a bucket. He would later credit much of the rebuilding of his life to Lucia Topolansky, another former Tupamaro prisoner who he took up with shortly after both were released and married in 2005. Her particular expertise had been in forgery. They rededicated themselves to democratic politics. Mujica was elected to parliament in 1994, Topolansky in 2000. It was her farm they lived on. They rode to work together on the same moped. Mujica became a senator, then a minister for agriculture. In 2009, he ran for Uruguay's presidency and won.
Y hay de aquellos que se creen que el poder está arriba y no se dan cuenta que el poder está en el corazón de las grandes masas. Gracias.
On the home front, President Mujica was a fiscal pragmatist and a social progressive. His administration liberalized Uruguay's line on marijuana, abortion and same-sex marriage and presided over an economic boom. The Switzerland of the Americas was back. Abroad, Mujica's picturesque backstory and unorthodox disinterest in the privileges of power attracted his country an amount of international attention historically unusual. Other presidents, said Mujica, seemed to respect him, though they thought he was, quote, a weirdo. Mujica was still popular when he left office after 5 years. Uruguayan presidents are limited to a single term at a time. He was succeeded by the colleague he'd followed, Tabaré Vázquez. When President Vázquez's vice president, Raul Sendic Jr., son of the Tupamaros founder, was undone by scandal, he was replaced by now Senator Lucia Topolansky, returning Mujica to the spotlight as Uruguay's second gentleman. In his last years, Mujica was happy enough to be interviewed by reporters willing to bump along the dirt road to the farm. Age did not diminish his way with the bleak stoical aphorism, among them such confrontingly modest maxims as, "I dedicated myself to changing the world and didn't change a damn thing, but I was entertained," and "Culture is the daughter of nonsense," which, to be clear, he meant approvingly. He was, to the end, genially grumpy, if genuinely perplexed by a world which insisted on placing such a high priority on stuff. Summing up the acquisitive modern condition, he once wondered out loud, "We make garbage and work in pain, and for what?" There are only 3.5 million Uruguayans, he became fond of harumphing, who every year import 27 million pairs of shoes. Are we centipedes? For Monocle Radio, I'm Andrew Muller.
Andrew Muller there on the life of Uruguay's former president, Pepe Mujica. You're listening to Monocle Radio. And finally, on today's show, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development has been holding its annual meeting right here in London this week, with a focus on reconstruction for Ukraine, among other things. And among the attendees at the summit has been Monocle's own Deputy Head of Radio, Tom Webb. Tom, welcome to the studio.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm freshly back, though it's happening right now.
It is still happening right now. It's a multi-day summit. What did you learn?
Well, I learned what EBRD stands for.
Let's start with that, the simple facts.
Yeah, I had to write it down because the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, as you say, they meet every year. This year they're meeting in London, which is where their headquarters are. They've begun in Paris. And they're going to Sofia next year. They were founded in 1991, and their whole purpose was to originally help rebuild the former Eastern Bloc after the Soviet Union collapsed. And now they're developing more than 30 countries from Central Europe to Central Asia, and it's about investment as a tool to build market economies. As you mentioned, they're one of the largest investors in Ukraine, and that's everything from energy, infrastructure to bionic arms for injured soldiers. And they're hosting all finance ministers from around the world, and that's why I was there to meet them and find out what some of the sessions were.
And reconstruction is in the name. It's very much in their ethos. What did you learn? Who did you speak to while you were there?
Well, I was there day one, and day one was the launch of their economic prospects. Just like the World Economic Forum, they have this big report that they begin proceedings with, and it's called a growth forecast, but there was no growth. In fact, their forecast says that there's going to be a very slow economy. Each one of the regions, the 30 regions there, standing at 3%. Now, they had predicted a rise of at least 3.5% for some of them. And this is all down to tariff hikes, as you can imagine. Now, on this launch panel was Lord O'Neill of Gatley. He's the former chief economist of Goldman Sachs and chair of Chatham House. He came up with the term BRIC, if you're interested, if we're talking about difficult acronyms. It used to be called...
acronym, thank
another
you for that.
one.
But
yeah,
a good one.
A good one. It used to be called CRIB, so you can see what he's done there. So I spoke to him after the panel. Now, he sounds like he should be narrating a documentary about salvage hunting or gang warfare, but he is one of the brightest minds in the business. I asked about his reaction to Liberation Day.
I mean, I was torn between utter amusement and utter bafflement about what the US was seemingly trying to seriously propose doing. And the only conclusion that I could make within 24 hours is it wouldn't last, because it would be pretty obvious that the biggest loser in the immediate future from it would be all the things that have made the US so great the past 30, 40 years. And if you look how the US stock market performed, that's what the market reaction was. So it's no surprise to me that they've rowed back on a lot of that. And I don't believe it's because there's any real major change that they've got excited about yet from other countries. It's because they've realised it will be very, very damaging for the near-term prospects of the US economy, and with it, probably pretty damaging for the Republican Party, which doesn't seem like it often, but ultimately that's where Trump's getting his legitimacy from.
Tom, bafflement is a pretty strong word to hear from a former economist. You spoke to quite a few people about the tariff stuff, didn't you?
It was so difficult to avoid, completely dominating all discussions, which makes these meetings really, really difficult. So the economists there were actually calling the summit more of a listening post because nothing concrete could really come out of the meeting. It wasn't all doom and gloom, though. When I spoke to the Lord about areas that were doing well, he spoke quite well about China.
But what is really intriguing, if you look at the minutiae, Chinese growth so far this year has actually been a bit stronger than the sell-side consensus has been forecasting. And whilst one can show very easily that the kind of tariff scale shock that would negatively affect Chinese exports, actually, even with the very latest Chinese trade data, the trade exports are stronger than you might have thought. And whether that's because the Chinese are so well prepared in anticipation of this shock and diverting exports to elsewhere, I think it's a little bit early to say. But I think the real story there so far is the shock hasn't shown signs of negatively affecting China yet as much as you might have thought.
It is interesting, Tom, to hear optimism about China, pessimism about the United States.
It really, really is. And the final region, which was a bit of a surprise, is Europe. Now, the entire bank relies on the performances of Europe as a whole, and you would think that things are looking a little bit turbulent. However, their forecast for the region is not as damaging as you might expect. And this is Lord Gatley's take on the region.
What intrigued me about all of the interplay of these things is late last year, the German central bank, which is historically so conservative, put out a piece saying that they believe the German fiscal relationship with its structure should change and they should drop the limits. And I thought that was a big moment. When I was interviewed in things like this, I said, well, that seems to me that we might enter an era where European equity markets outperform the US. And that actually started to happen before Liberation Day. And I think that's the underlying theme that's going to last through this. It's going to be very erratic. In the near term, actually, US markets have outperformed again. But I think what we've started since the very early part of this year is something that might go on for a few years, which we've not seen since the beginning of this millennium.
Lord Gatley there with a look at the regions of the world, speaking to Monocle's Tom Webb. Thank you very much for joining us. That's all the time we have for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Hassan Anderson. Our researcher was Francesca Jilks, and our studio manager was Flynn Simons. The Briefing is back tomorrow at the same time. I'm Chris Chermak. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.